The Lyrians came to a crossroads. As Meve and her scouts conferred about the proper path to take, a footman, of a sudden, collapsed upon the muddy ground. His comrades strove to rouse him. Alas, to no avail. Meve called for a medic. One arrived post-haste. He checked for wounds, a heartbeat, all else for which a medic checks. Then he peered down the soldier's throat. In a flash, he was on his feet, his hand over his mouth, backing away.
What's with him? What's wrong?
The Queen asked, her eyes darting between the medic and his patient.
Typhus exanthematicus, Your Grace.
Replied the physician, wiping his hands with a spirit-soaked cloth.
Typhus fever.
Contagious?
Extremely, I fear. Though not yet at this stage. The spots are but in his mouth for now. Tomorrow he'll be blotched all over. It's then the disease turns infectious.
I see. What about a cure? Is one known?
The medic looked at Meve, shook his head and shrugged. Alas, there was precisely naught he could do. But where medicine fails, magic may at times stand in. Without giving it two thoughts, Meve called for Isbel.
It's typhus, I've no doubt.
The healer confirmed.
I know a spell that could be helpful. Vigal's cleansing, we call it. It takes time to prepare and many ingredients. Rather costly, or...
Coin's no object,
said Meve.
Get to work at once.
Isbel returned from the local herbalist with herbs valuable and rare. Fern blossoms, mandrake root, comfrey seeds, and more. She then pulled from her bundle a variety of vessels, funnels, retorts, alembics, carafes. Colored concoctions she then brewed, steam and strange odors rising from them. Hours later, after much effort, she had a few drops of a thick substance in a flask. Isbel whispered an incantation, then gave the remedy to the dying man. His tremors and fever subsided at once, the other symptoms fading within hours. At last, Meve could breathe a deep sigh of relief. In the distance, Meve spotted a spindle-like shape, which soon proved an enormous, dark obelisk. It stood in the middle of a wetland clearing. Dozens of iron rings dangled from its shaft, clinking and rattling in gusts of wind. Cows, donkeys, and dogs were gathered round the stone, all tied to the rings by ropes. Their hides showed many shallow cuts, seeping blood, festering, drawing mosquitoes in swarms. A number of the animals struggled against their cords, while others, near dead, lay still in the wet, tall grass. Across the clearing, folk emerged from the woods, a handful of peasants with a mule in tow. The beast resisted, stomped and planted its hooves, perhaps sensing its gruesome fate. The Queen decided to question the peasants, and soon learned the animals were their sacrifice to the swamp gods.
They're all about, dearie. Very close. Oh, very, very close.
The toothless old woman whispered.
They hide neath murky waters. Can't feed when they hear the drip of blood. The gods look kindly on those what make an offering.
I know nothing of your gods,
began the Queen, her nose crinkled in disgust.
but any that demand such grisly tribute are not at all worthy of reverence. What you do to these creatures is savagery. Savagery I can't allow.
Run us off, you can.
Replied the old shrew.
For as soon as you're gone, we'll come back. As ever, we'll come back.
This I know. So I must take care to leave you naught to come back to.
Over the peasants' howls and pleas, Meve ordered the obelisk brought down. Her soldiers gripped the ropes that hung from it and toppled the shaft. As it hit the ground, it shattered into many smaller pieces.
You say you know nought of our gods?
The old woman's eyes narrowed, her voice grew darker still.
Well, don't you worry your head, sweetie. You'll meet him soon enough. They'll tangle your parts, sow a pox among you, drive you to madness, every last one. I curse you, all of you, in Geralt name.
Undisturbed by the Harridan's screamed threats, Meve rode on. But her men whispered long of the curse. It weighed on their minds, poisoned their hearts. Each misstep Misfortune they saw as punishment for their sacrilege. Meve stood waiting while her scouts cut through the tangled branches and roots that had overgrown the trail through the swamp. Suddenly, a soldier doubled over and began to retch blood. The same symptoms soon afflicted others in her ranks.
A potent poison,
Was the medic's verdict. It seemed all those who'd fallen ill had shared a tent. One night, they'd chattered about an obelisk they'd destroyed and the group of incensed peasants who'd cursed them for it. Fearing for their lives, the footman had gone to a local herbalist. She'd brewed them a potion to ward off black magic. Alas, the concoction had proved poisonous, while the herbalist had vanished without a trace. Happily, Isbel concocted an antidote in time to deliver the soldiers from a certain and agonizing death. The mage explained their misfortune had not issued from a dark, corrupt force, but from simple human wickedness. Her calming voice and gentle smile lifted the soldiers' spirits. Trusting in her care, they soon wholly forgot the so-called curse. Meve now witnessed a sorry sight. A mass funeral for miners killed due to a tragic convergence of events. Their lead caskets lay upon the snow, wreaths of hop cones laid upon them in turn. The mourners waited for the diggers to finish. The digging was tough, for the ground was frozen. As the crunch and thud of picks and shovels continued, the dead miner's foreman scrambled onto a boulder to make a speech. Angry shouts and loud booing stopped him.
You knew it! You knew they'd smell vapours, but you ordered them to keep digging till it blew up in their faces!
Make the daily quota whatever the cost, eh?
You've blood on your mitts, whoreson!
A mourner then picked up a chunk of frozen ground and threw it at the foreman. Blood spurted from the gash that appeared on his forehead. The first dirt chunk was followed by another, then by a rock, a brick. Meve realized that if she did not intervene, the foreman stood to be stoned to death. Something had to be done quickly. Meve saw this clearly. She spurred her mount and rode into the cemetery, pushing through the throng, then stopping before the foreman, the horse shielding him from further blows.
Calm yourselves! Silence! His guilt cannot be decided here. It must!
Before Meve could finish her plea, a large rock thrown from the crowd struck her bosom, nearly knocking her from her saddle. Upon seeing this, her Lyrian escort lowered spears and drew swords and rushed at the angry mourners.
Shino Kren!
Isbel cried out. Her hands began to radiate a fierce light that blinded both dwarves and Lyrians alike.
Have you lost your minds, all of you together? Not had your fill of misfortune yet? Lower your arms at once.
Whether the power of Isbel's magic or the force of her appeal had the greater effect is difficult to say for certain. Either way, both sides suddenly lost the desire to fight. Meve breathed a sigh of relief, aware that if not for Isbel's intervention, a great amount of blood would have been spilled at that cemetery. The Queen managed to save the fore-dwarf from being lynched, at a price. Many Lyrians emerged from the rumble heavily wounded. Losses among the mourners were much greater. The gravediggers dug the new graves with ease, as the previously frozen ground, warmed by the spilt blood, gave in easily to their shovels. When it was over, seeing what had happened, the fore-dwarf fell to his knees and hid his face in his hands.
They had it right. Those miners died because of me. Because of my cock-up. And now, they're kin.
Though the dwarven elders thanked Meve for stepping in and preventing the four dwarves' lawless lynching, the Queen left the cemetery with a bitter taste in her mouth. The medic gazed at Meve, shook his head and shrugged. On a cloth laid on the ground, the afflicted convulsed and mumbled feverishly.
What does one do in such a case?
Your Majesty, it sounds cruel, I know, but we must leave him and march on. Else our force could be decimated by an epidemic in the ranks.
Might he recover? Is there a chance?
asked the Queen of the Surgeon.
Perhaps 1 in 50, Your Grace, but...
But there is a chance.
Your Majesty, I must warn you.
You have already, it's been noted. Now get that man onto a wagon.
Meve gave the order to march and rode at the fore, undoubtedly to hide the fear and concern in her eyes. The Queen visited the field hospital to look in on the ailing man. She learned his suffering had come to an end. He lay motionless beneath a gossamer-thin cloth. Only his rash-mottled feet were exposed. Though they burned his body the very next day, 4 other soldiers showed symptoms of the disease. 1 day later, there were 20. 2 days on, even more. Feverish, they staggered, labored, frequently collapsed. Meve was forced to halt the march and await the worst. When at last the force moved on, it left many fresh graves in its wake.